Namaste, everyone. Welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. This is your host, Kushalmehra. All right, today's podcast is called War, the Making and Unmaking of Man. And to talk about war with me is Razib Khan. Razib, welcome.
What's up, bro?
Well, okay, let's start with this. What's with you and war, man? Why did you have to write two essays on war?
Well, no, I mean the issue is like they're not two essays. What happens is Substack, Substack is limited by the length that, like, how much data an email will send before it truncates. And so when I get above 5,000 words, then I gotta like split it up, right? So like these are like it's an 8,000 word essay that I had to do in two parts. So I mean, I've had like a 5-parter before, like genetic history of Finland, and that was one thing originally that I broke down. So I mean, it is as far as war. I mean, look, I mean, I try not to be too topical to the time, but it's been on a lot of people's minds, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and all that stuff. So I wrote, a couple of pieces on war that I think I liked. Pretty much everything on my Substack, you should be able to read years later and get almost the exact same value out of it. And I think that this is true of these two pieces. But I did write them because I think people are thinking about war right now and why it's happening and the insanity of it.
So maybe let's start with this. So why call it war and not conflict? Or is there a differentiation between, say, a mano, or a woman or man, a woman on women, or whatever gender they want to use, and let's say war? So is there a difference in your mind when you were writing this?
Yes. Yeah, so conflict is the superset category. Obviously, war is conflict, but I don't think all conflict is war. So if there's like domestic violence within the household, that's conflict, but that's not war. If you go to another town and you have an enemy there and you beat them up, that's a fight. That's conflict, but that's not war. What is war? War, I define as an organized, violent, physical conflict between two different groups, usually, actually, probably necessarily with different identities of some sort, right? National identity, usually ethnic identity. It could be a regional identity, as in the United States. Although the United States, the Civil War was actually, it was more than regional. It was an ethnic identity between Northern Yankees and Southern Cavaliers and whatnot. So usually they're different groups with different cultural identities that are engaged in organized violence against each other.
So would you say when we talk about something like war, so what's the qualifying criteria? How many people or how many subsets need to be involved to categorize? So I'll give you a hypothetical, right? So is war post-agricultural or pre-agricultural, or is war also equally applicable to current hunter-gatherers? That's what I'm trying to understand.
Yeah, so in my piece, I do give examples of hunter-gatherer war. So the earliest massacre of like a mass grave is found in Sudan. I think it dates to 13,000 years ago. So like right at the end of the last ice age, definitely before agriculture. They're hunter-gatherers. And when the Europeans came to Australia, they did describe Australian Aboriginal wars, which are clans and tribes coming together to engage in these vast melees. So I think it's pre-agricultural, and it's about scale. And we have to remember hunter-gatherers, they occupied much more fertile land before agriculture. So some hunter-gatherer groups were probably pretty large. So yes, I think hunter-gatherers, humans as foragers, engaged in war, organized intergroup conflict. Okay, I think they engage in organized intergroup conflict. We would call them wars. They're small wars, petty wars. Perhaps you'll say they're raids, but they are wars.
So maybe talk about this thing. You in your piece you say war has driven the creation of what evolutionary theorist Peter Turchin refers to as ultra society, as small human tribes scaled up to nation states. So what does he mean over there?
Yeah, so he has a book called Ultra Society. People should check it out. It's a really good book. So Ultra Society is basically tries to explain how the Ultra Society emerged. So we are the Ultra Society. So you live in a country, in a nation, state, nation, civilization, whatever you want to call it, of like what, like you're at 1.3 to 4 billion, right? I live in a nation of 330 million. These are societies that are agglomerations of hundreds of millions and billions. These are ultra societies like eusocial. We are as big on the national scale as the biggest, army or ant or termite colonies, right? Which are usually actually on the order of millions. They're not hundreds of millions or billions, so we can scale really, really intensely. How did that happen? I don't want to like totally like Turchin's thesis is complicated. There's some evolutionary thinking, but basically the idea is you have competition between groups, and these are games, and the groups have characteristics, and the groups that win, they spread their characteristics throughout the population, throughout the culture, throughout the species, right? And so what happens is the bigger groups usually win, the bigger cohesive groups that can scale up, So for example, this is just a hypothesis, but I mean, it's probably true. You might have a situation where in like 50,000 years ago, in Africa, some tribe decides that instead of just kind of like the regular animistic gods of like nature, they're going to worship a tribal god from which all the men in the tribe are descended, like a father type of god, right? A totemic god. And so perhaps it turns out that this abstraction of this, immortal leader with these characteristics that everyone can emotionally attach to allows the tribe to scale larger and become bigger rather than simply depending on familial connections and just interpersonal relationships that need to be managed constantly. Maybe this is a cultural invention that allows a bigger tribe, more powerful tribe. And so this tribe defeats other tribes. So what do you do now? You either like absorb the other tribes or get bigger, or the other tribes mimic you. So all of a sudden they have tribal gods. And all of a sudden all the tribes have tribal gods, right? And so now the tribes are all bigger because having a tribal god allows you to scale more. So this is how you get the ultra society, right? So for example, Turchin has this idea of meta-ethnic identity. So you have empires. How do you bind empires together? The simplest way to bind an empire together is through the charismatic figure of the emperor, right? The emperor and his family. And so this was like how Rome did it, and it's how China does it. But there's also an ideology around it. So Rome eventually got the ideology of Christianity. So, under Christ, there's no Gentile, there's no Jew, right? All of the different nations are under Christ. And so all of a sudden you have this empire with a singular religion, with a singular God, or, triune God, but whatever, you know what I'm saying. The Islamic world is similar. Hindu world is similar, where you can go from one end of Aryavarta to the other end of Aryavarta, and it's all under the Dharma. It's all under a common law, set of rules. Ibn Battuta goes through the Islamic world from like China to like Morocco, and it's all under Sharia, right? Like all the Islamic communities are under Sharia. And so these are like a common set of rules that span many ethnicities. Whatever, whether you're black or white or brown as a Muslim, it doesn't matter. In India, it doesn't matter if you speak, South Indian language, or you speak like Punjabi or whatever, or like, one of the North Indian languages. You're all part of Aryavarta, from, Jaffna all the way to the Himalayas, right? And in China, they have the idea, this Confucian idea that China is a civilized state, and has a mandate of heaven under the emperor, and everyone can be Chinese, really, if you become civilized, because that's what to be Chinese is to be civilized, and to be civilized is to be Chinese. And so, these barbarians are assimilated into the Chinese order, right? So this is how the ultra society emerges. Now, I want to focus on war because how does this sorting happen? How does this evolution happen? So how does evolution happen? Evolution happens through, cooperation and competition, through reproductive fitness, through variation. And so I'm talking in the piece about like, okay, what are the fundamental cognitive characteristics that allow for war, violence, and aggression? This is the raw material. The raw material coalesces together into this cooperative entity. This cooperative entity engages in competition and violence with another cooperative entity. And so then you have selection happening between the groups, between their cultures, and then the culture that is better at war will spread. Okay. And so I give you guys another example. Why did the Romans beat the Carthaginians? If you read a lot about the Punic War, one thing that just seems clear is the Romans had a social organization that allowed them to constantly replace soldiers lost in battle. So the Carthaginians could never totally defeat the Romans because they could win battles, but they couldn't win the war. And the Carthaginians, they used mercenaries and other things that just were not. They had like more limited capacity there, and so the Romans just kept throwing armies at them and just eventually overwhelmed the Carthaginians. It wasn't through. I mean, it wasn't really through technology. It wasn't through greater tactical genius. I mean, who was the best tactical genius during the Punic Wars? It was actually a Carthaginian general, Hannibal. I think everyone admits that. Everyone should read the Battle of Cannae, where Hannibal defeated the Romans. It was one of the greatest battles in history, and Hannibal brought these elephants and things to Italy. He went all the way up along the coast. I mean, he did like all these things. Hannibal was a genius, but he lost. And he lost because the Romans had a better social organization. They were a better ultra society. Right? They scaled better. And there are historians like Walter Scheidel who studied this, who the Romans are kind of exceptional in terms of I mean, how did they conquer the empire? Like, what happened? It just turns out they mobilized more of their society to military, just towards the military. They had an incredible cohesion and group solidarity for a period, and that allowed them to expand. Obviously, they lost that solidarity over time. The empire fell, but the point is, war is the method by which the selection is operating, and so it's been creative in many ways. Another thing that I pointed out is I'm just gonna give you like weird examples, but this is really what I'm getting at. Canning, okay, cans, like canned food. That was invented 200 years ago during the more than 200 years ago during the Napoleonic Wars. Because it's for logistics and rations, like Napoleon said, an army marches on its stomach, right? And so they created canned food for that. So there's been a lot of things that were invented for war, because it's important to win a war. Like in the past, not in the recent past, but in the past, if your society lost the war, it could be that all the men are killed and all the women and children are enslaved. So you will do whatever you can to win a war, in theory. And so that drives a lot of innovation. This like just intense competition.
In fact, if I was to add to this, if I was to look at the modern day uh, military industrial complex, a lot of these inventions that we have, even the internet in many ways, or many other things, are in a in a way the product of the military, right? The military gets interested
The
into
internet.
multiple things.
Yeah, I mentioned that. I didn't mention DARPA. So DARPA, the internet, right? But I guess what I was, I did mention the computer. So the original computers. I mean, obviously there's the difference engine. There's Babbage's analog computer, but kind of like a quantum leap in computing did happen during World War II to solve certain problems, whether it's like cryptography, decoding, certain like trajectory related issues and whatnot. And then right after World War II, the military industrial complex really invested a lot in computing. If you read about John von Neumann's life and his later research with Rand.
So you say the instincts that lead to war are written in our very genome, as the influence of our genes wafts upward, shapes our psychology, and nudges our social lives.
Yeah.
So when we say written in our very genome, now there is potential for people to commit the naturalistic fallacy over here, right? Potential to say, maybe in that sense, that what do you mean when you say written in our genome, as in we are just primed for it, or in what sense?
Well, I mean, so I have another couple of pieces about like the Koreos Indo-European Curios, like from a couple weeks ago. People can find on my Substack, and I have a graph on there. It shows homicide rates pretty much everywhere in the world. Homicide rates peak with 21-year-old males, right?
Mhm.
And men are about 10 times as likely to commit murder as women. Okay. So why is this? I mean, men and women have a sex chromosome difference. Okay, that's what's like, but really, there's a biological difference between men and women. Men are about like twice as strong in the upper body as women. We have way more muscle mass proportionally. Our aggression means we're more. Our testosterone means we're more aggressive. So males between the two sexes are more violent. They're more prone to organized violence than females, right? And so that's what I mean written in our genes. This is primal. Um, Probably I mean, look, I mean, there was like fighting within the clan, between the clans. Probably in many areas, tribes were very territorial. And if it was a stranger, like maybe you'd like enslave them or something, or just kill them. Like maybe if you see a stranger in your territory, you just automatically think it's a scout and they're gonna raid or something. So you got to kill it, kill the stranger. And so violence is part of our inheritance, just like peace is part of our inheritance. Obviously, we can be peaceful. It's we can do that, right? Just like we can be vegetarians and we can do like the Petersons do and just eat steak. Like we're flexible. So that's just a fact. And so it's not like, look, I have sons. You don't have to tell little boys, you don't have to instruct them how to fight.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
what does war do? War channels it. What is sports? What is a lot of sports? It's actually
Mhm.
a way in lieu of military combat. Like a lot of sports emerged, like polo is a very early sport, right? Polo is a game of kings, but like I mean, polo was invented by Eurasian steppe nomads, like some of the most like warlike people in the history of the world. So a lot of sports do come from either militaries, like they did it in a leisure time, or it came from some military endeavor. Like I mean, archery, like where does that come from? I mean, like obviously
Mhm.
shooting by definition. And so sports, competition, war, these are cultural endeavors that are co-opting tendencies that our species has, in particular males. Males are much more into agonistic competition. Those of you who know evolutionary biology probably know why. We have to compete for mates and all that stuff. And so we snap into units, into cohesive units periodically, a band of brothers, and we engage in intergroup competition too. And I think that this is an ancient thing. What modern wars are is kind of an artificial extension and scaling up of that. Obviously, like like the American military is like a whole society, so it's really weird to compare it to an ancient, Neolithic war band. But when you get down to it, what is like SEAL Team 6 or whatever? Like it's a
Mhm.
Neolithic war band that has like really modern. I mean, it literally they behave like Neolithic war bands, like they hit and run. You know, so the fundamental, core is still the same.
So if I was to understand what you're saying is there might be proximate differences, but at the ultimate level, we kind of behave the same way, even when you use the example of the SEAL team, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
All
Yeah.
right.
I mean, it's like, we revert to form, when you strip it away. When you strip it away, we can revert to form. Like the complex edifice of culture and civility and norms, underneath that, there's other things, and you just need to poke at it, and like, we've seen this. Okay. So, this is kind of unrelated to war, but it's kind of related to war. Germany, Nazi Germany. I'm not like, I mean, I've read The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. I've read some Nazi stuff. I'm not like super into it because, kind of like figure it out after like the first couple of passes. But the issue is like, if you want to, the Nazis, like, they did so much, they kept doing like so much different, diverse, bad stuff. You could spend a lifetime reading about the different evil things they did. Because like it wasn't just the same evil stuff. So I just found out 2 days ago. You guys can Google it. They apparently found a graveyard of buried individuals. Half of them were babies outside of St. Petersburg, and it looks like it was a blood farm. So the Nazis had a blood farm of children, babies, pregnant women. And what happens is, so they were doing the siege of Leningrad, and when the SS soldiers would lose a lot of blood and they were injured, they'd get a baby, drain the baby, put it in the soldier, and then of course the baby dies, and they would just bury the baby.
Oh my
So
goodness.
I'm giving you this example, being okay. Who are the Nazis? These are people. It's Germany. This is like the land of Goethe, Schiller, Beethoven. I mean, this is like a very civilized people, right? People of Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, Kant, uh, just name it, right? Name it. And then like within like 15 years, we're talking like horror show stuff. And like
Just
the
like
things
this.
that they did, our Neolithic ancestors did like atrocities too against women and children, So, but I mean, they added a little bit of technological pizzazz so that yeah.
Yeah. So their barbarism had a little bit of upgrade. That's all we can say.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
okay. So, this was something interesting that you've written, the Killer Ape Hypothesis, and how you disagree with it. Maybe you could explain that, because I found that
Mhm.
very interesting.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of like the origins of war, I think I had to mention the Killer Ape Hypothesis by Raymond Dart. And basically, the idea is like, okay, well, humans, why do we have these stereoscopic eyes? Why do we have this big brain? Why do we cooperate with each other, et cetera, et cetera? Well, it's because on the savannah, we became predators, right? We were the killer ape. We were like the carnivorous ape, basically. Obviously, we can eat vegetables and there's gathering and stuff like that. But Raymond Dart and like the Killer Ape people basically dismissed it, and they were like, "We have a big brain because we need a big brain and big eyes that are stereoscopic, that are forward looking, to hunt animals. And we have to cooperate to hunt animals. And we kill the animals and we eat the meat, and the meat is high calorie density, and that feeds the brain. And we have to be upright because we have to see the animal. So there's all these sorts of explanations for why humans are the way they are, because they're like cooperative hunters, cooperative hunters. So it's driven by males. Um, and this is also why we're violent, right? Because we are violent hunters. We're carnivores, we're beasts. Well, I mean, what I point out is, one, our mostly fruitarian cousins engage in cannibalism and wars as well. The common chimpanzees and the bonobo, actually. The gorilla is a total vegetarian. I mean, okay, like most vegetarians will actually eat meat sometimes. So I want, like, I don't want someone to be like, well, actually, like, I looked this up, and yes, gorillas will eat meat sometimes, but it's like almost totally a vegetarian. But male gorillas are enormous and they have harems, and they're intensely violent with each other to defend their harems, right? And so they're not carnivores, they're not hunters, but there's some violence there, there's some aggression there. So we don't need like the hunting and all that stuff to explain it. We have a lot of archaeological evidence now that we're just very diverse in terms of what we can do. We can facultatively like be beachcombers and rely on marine resources, so foragers. We don't really, it's not really hunting, it's kind of gathering, but gathering animal, protein. Obviously, we hunt in many situations. So in Siberia, you're going to be hunting a lot because for a lot of the year, there's not much to gather. So animal protein is a big deal. Eskimos, Inuit, there's not much green in the Arctic. So one thing that they do is they eat seaweed that's partly digested in the stomachs of the seals they kill, because you need like some vitamins, some micronutrients from vegetables. You can't you. I mean, I don't know how the Petersons are living just on steak, but um, maybe they take like there are. I have a friend who's basically a carnivore, but he takes supplements. He takes like vegetable supplements. Basically, it's like a green pill, and that's all. He doesn't like vegetables. Anyway, so the point is, the Killer Ape hypothesis is wrong because there's just a lot of archaeological and evolutionary evidence. So we're just like too diverse. We're not just like pure hunters, right? Like our violence doesn't come from pure hunting. Um, that is focusing on like, oh, human interaction with other species, but a lot of our violence and a lot of our aggression, like in a lot of species, is intraspecific. It's human to human, you know. And so I think that that's the key thing. We're cooperative, we're social, and in a Malthusian environment where you're competing for scarce resources. Did you watch the movie Noah?
No, I'm not, man. I'm not much
So
of a
guys out
movie
there,
guy.
go to YouTube and Google movie Noah cannibalism. You'll see some pretty scary YouTube scenes from that movie. Basically, the movie Noah is about before the flood, and before the flood, the world is totally packed with humans. Malthusian limit. There's like almost no trees. It's packed with cities, and everyone's like really hungry. And so there's a scene where they like throw out an animal into a crowd of humans and they tear the animal apart and just eat it raw, you know? And so the point is, the situations of scarcity, people act crazy because they're hungry, you know? And so when humans hit the Malthusian limit, they're going to start competing with each other in groups, right? And so just like other animals, there's animal competition. You kill your neighbors or you drive them away, you have a bigger territory and you can survive. Like, they must die so that you must live. Like, these are the sort of things that happen in organisms that are, competing. Now, if you're a herbivore, that doesn't really happen too much. I mean, herbivores can be territorial, like, like whatever, like antelope. But what usually I think what happens with them is, they're kept in check by predators, and predators can keep them in check. But I mean, if the predators aren't keeping them in check, then they're going to overgraze and famine type situation, right? But you have other situations where animals are packed together and they start attacking each other with cannibalism or just aggression because they want more resources. So I mean, tadpoles will do this in ponds that have too many tadpoles at the beginning. Some of the tadpoles will become cannibals to clear out room from the other tadpoles, right? And so I'm not saying humans are necessarily cannibals. Humans do ritual cannibalism, but really I think what humans do is we're good at reproducing, filling up the environment, and then once we're at like peak density, we start clearing each other out. So the four horsemen of the apocalypse, right? Like war is one of them. There's obviously
Mm-hmm.
pestilence and other things like that, but I think war, conflict was a big way that people probably got killed in the past or died.
So, just a query. So, when you say the Malthusian limit, is this the same guy who had predicted India is going to have a huge problem about agriculture and all that stuff?
Yeah, I mean that was Paul Ehrlich. I don't think Thomas Malthus thought too much about India. He was actually focused on mostly England. But so I will say something about Malthus. There's kind of like a misunderstanding of him, and I had this misunderstanding when I was a kid too. So Malthus like said two things, and one of the things he said was right, and one of the things he said was wrong. The thing that he said was pretty much right during his time, and in fact, even to the modern day, with the exception of maybe the '60s with the Green Revolution, is that our improvements in agricultural technology will kind of increase geometrically, right? So more linearly, let's say more linearly, right? So they get better over time. But our population will increase exponentially. So the
Mm-hmm.
population will outrun our technological growth. So Malthus was right about the geometric improvement of agriculture. In general, I mean, at least for a century, up until the Haber-Bosch process and artificial fertilizer. What he was wrong about was he did not anticipate the demographic transition. And so instead of the population catching up to the increased agricultural output all the time, with industrialization and urbanization, all of it, and like lower infant mortality, all of a sudden the fertility rate started crashing. And so we don't live in a Malthusian world because the fertility rate crashed, and our agricultural techniques kept getting better with fertilizer, green revolution, and so we got out of the trap. But we got out of the trap by just not reproducing as much as Malthus expected we would reproduce. Because for most of human history, people reproduce right to their like I just with the income that I have, I could probably have dozens of children. I think that they would all be wearing each other's clothes. I mean, I'm just saying, like, I'm not saying they'd be living at a high standard. And so that's
Hold
why I
your
have 3
horses, buddy.
children. That's why I have 3 children. You know what I'm saying? Because we expect our children to live a certain standard, and also like we don't anticipate our children will die, so we don't like have all these backup children. Infant mortality is low, right? So, but in terms of war, one of the common theories for the origins of war is just Malthusianism. That when you hit a limit in your territory, you're just going to engage in intergroup competition.
All right. So then you go into, you call it Darwin versus Marx, but I want to talk about something else with you over here. I want to talk about maybe Hobbes versus Rousseau, the Hobbesian model and the Rousseauian model of looking at the world. So, for people who may not know, so Rousseau had this model which he used to call the noble savage, right? That people were really nice to each other. Everybody was holding hands together and singing Kumbaya. Obviously, I'm kind of mocking the view and paraphrasing it, but that was pretty much the Rousseauian view, and Hobbesian view was slightly different. I guess the closest in modern day parlance to promote the Hobbesian worldview, if I'm not wrong, would be Steven Pinker, right? He would be more in the Hobbesian kind of way of looking at things.
And I think the blank slate, that was what he was. That was a view he kind of defended. Yeah.
So maybe we can touch upon the Rousseauian view. So what do you think would be problematic according to you in the Rousseauian view? Because according to Rousseau, when you are talking about war, I'll say very specifically, because in your essay, you clearly, when you talk about it, you talk about 100,000-year journey, which takes up, let's say, to 1,000 BC or something, where you say we come and we have formed ourselves as a species and we've consistently fought all the time. And I remember reading, so pardon me, people, I'm very bad with names when it comes to books, but I recently read a book on anthropology. I think it was Joseph Kelly. Remember, Razib, I told you about this book too in a private chat.
Lawrence Keeley, The War Before
Lawrence Keeley,
Civilization.
yeah. So there are different anthropological models, and those anthropological models, work around a lot of assumptions. They make a lot of assumptions about how people behave and how these problems come. Like, he talks about different models, the patch model, or that something called a diet model, and how different things lead to different results. So if I was to ask you, why do you think, what are the fundamental problems with say the Rousseauian view then, according to you?
So I do want to say, like, what you're saying is the standard description of the Rousseauian view. I haven't read Rousseau in a long time. My understanding is it was a little bit more subtle or complicated than that, but that's what people take away from it. So I think, like, let's go with the Rousseauian view. I think the issue with the Rousseauian view is that the state of nature is subject to scarcity and uncertainty, and so you cannot live in this like kind of kumbaya. Like, if there was guaranteed universal basic income in the Paleolithic, it would work, but there wasn't. Like, if you didn't work, you died. And so, reality imposed, it just imposed things on us. And so, scarcity, there's no free lunch. This is just reality. And so, also in the Rousseauian view, there's issues relating to game theory where it's like, if you're like nice to everybody, they're going to take advantage of you, and then the cheating strategy spread, and so you need to do tit for tat, et cetera, right? So I think the Rousseauian view is just like too extreme. We have some of that. We have some of this like natural, noble savage. Like, all human beings have some element of goodness and badness, and however we define it. We have differences in terms of our ethics and morals based on what our cultures decide and historical progress and all these other things. But I think the Rousseauian view just ignores economic, evolutionary, ecological realities.
So okay, let me play the devil's advocate here. So the Rousseauian would say maybe the evolutionary theory itself is based on certain broad-based assumptions that may not be true, and they would pick this particular tribe, let's say in X part of Africa or in the Amazon area, and they'd say, look, they don't behave like that. So here, Dr. Razib Khan, I've proven you wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, so the issue is like there are going to be exceptions over time to the rules. So I pointed out my piece. There's a Chatham Islanders off New Zealand. They're a branch of the Maori people. What happened is they got isolated. I think they actually like forgot how to do the kayaks, and they became really peaceful. It was just an experiment. Or it was a social change, because the Maori were pretty violent and warlike, their ancestors that arrived, but then they got isolated and they're like, we're going to change and we're going to become peaceful, and they stayed pretty peaceful. And the Europeans discovered them and were like, oh, they're just like Maori, but they're peaceful. And so the Maori found out about them, I think, and they sent an expedition and they enslaved them. And so my point to use that illustration is, this is what I'm saying when you have competition, right? There was this like peaceful group that's like, we'll be nice to everybody. Even they were accommodating to their Maori cousins. And then the Maori cousins were like, okay, we're going to kill you now. We're going to enslave you now. Why? Because we can. Right. And so Vegetius, the strategos from like the 4th century AD said, to maintain the peace, prepare for war. And so that's how the Rusuvian view fails. And like we have many illustrations of that. There are many illustrations of societies that have not known war, but those societies are not going to persist for a very long time, unless they can defend themselves. So here's an evolutionary analogy. There are many asexual lineages of insect, and they tend to reproduce faster because if they're all females, they all gestate. But they have short lifespans evolutionarily because they tend to go extinct. There's evolutionarily brittle, right? So you can have this idea of like, like it's great living in a peaceful society, right? You chill, you don't have to prepare for war. I mean, have you seen the movie 300? Like those guys, like they went through a lot, right? I mean, you don't get abs like that without a lot of work, So, but the issue is like, yeah, you don't prepare for war and your neighbors conquer you. You become the Helots. You become Messenia, and Sparta conquers you. So that's how I would answer to that, because there's going to be plenty of exceptions. I mean, this is a statistical distribution over time, and that's what evolution is. That's what biological science is, statistical distributions. They're not deterministic like Newtonian mechanics.
Yeah. You know what I was thinking? How much of a factor war is? Obviously, in your part 2, you talk about the Odyssey as an example. You start with that, but I was just thinking about where I come from, my culture. Like imagine how many books, like even inside the Rig Veda there is the Varshagira war, this is the Dasharajna war, then the Bhagavad Gita is literally in the middle of a battle. Mahabharata is about a war, Ramayana is about a conflict. So in a very weird sense, if you look at it from a larger perspective, and if I was to use an evolutionary psychology example where you look for universal behaviors, so even if we look for universal behaviors cutting across post-agricultural civilizations, you'd find this trend where a lot of literature too, in a very interesting way, is actually based on wars.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so I didn't get into this because it was about war. It wasn't about like society and sociology and politics. So what happens is you start to get like, there are like in agricultural societies, like basically all able-bodied men are warriors, right? You pick up the spear, and instead of hunting with it, you go raid your enemy. Okay. But then what happens in agricultural societies is okay, you have to sow the crops and harvest the crops, and that causes a limitation on you. So how about you sequester some of your harvest and you give it to a specialized caste of warriors, and they can protect you all year from your enemies. Okay. But okay, your neighbors see this and they're like, okay, we got to do the same thing. So now there are two castes of warriors, right? And then there's the farmers who can farm and they do economic production. That's great. Here's the problem though. All of a sudden the warriors start realizing, you know what? Okay, we don't need to work for them. They can work for us, right? And so that's what always happens. I mean, and this actually happens like relatively recently. If you know like what happens to Mamelukes in the Islamic world, the slave dynasty, in India. They're called a slave dynasty because they were slave soldiers, Um, so the soldiers, the mercenaries, eventually they're like, wait a second, we got the weapons. Why are we working for them, right? And so that's this is so by the time of the Iron Age, these warrior castes, early Iron Age warrior castes became extremely dominant, and the warrior castes must have emerged because you had these specialized societies and you started having artisans and everything else. So you're like, okay, we got to have soldiers. So the Chinese were really, really, actually, they were Tang dynasty. They had a period where these warlords were very dominant, and they always had like social regulations in various ways to get the warrior caste, one, not to be a caste, but two, also just like to have it low status. This meant that they were actually vulnerable to invasion by barbarians, but thank God China for itself is actually relatively isolated, right? The Europeans didn't have that benefit, they're more exposed, etc., etc. Europeans are very warlike people when other people encountered them, like in the early modern period. Like that's what one thing other people said. They're like, they worship 3 gods, they don't take baths, and they're really warlike, and I say 3 gods of Trinity. You know what I'm saying? And so like this is what they observe. And so in Europe, the warrior caste remained the dominant caste. Arguably in the Islamic world, I think that's true too. In India, there was like a somewhat different thing, where the priests became preeminent. So in Indo-European societies, traditionally the warriors are preeminent and the priests are ancillary. The priestly caste is ancillary, and in India it flipped, right? So whatever, like some different things happen there. But yeah, I mean, these similarities are partly this evolution, convergent evolution, partly it's genealogical. There's actually parts of the Iliad that have exact analogs in the Mahabharata, and like also the Castor and Pollux are the Ashvin twins and stuff like that. So there's similarities in it. So that's actually genealogical. There's genealogical connect, and also like Achilles is like Arjuna, except he's way more of a dick. I mean, he's way less ethical. Let's put it that way. No dharma except his own glory. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. I guess I don't know. It's just the level of philosophical evolution was also there. Maybe they are at different times, and those societies were at different levels.
Well, so I mean I pointed out in the piece what happened during the Axial Age, like around 500 BC. You have all of these like ethical, philosophical religions, and I think they emerged partly because they're like, okay, we have these like. This is actually Peter Turchin's idea too. He's elaborated. I want to give him credit in his works. He's elaborated in detail. War, peace, and war, but I think is the one he talks about a lot. These warlike societies are really unstable. They're killing each other. They have a lot of coups internally, and so at some point you got to be like, okay, there's got to be more than war in the world. We need some stability and some peace, and so you introduce this idea of like religions and like a king in heaven who mediates all these things. In the Chinese society, the warrior caste, the Shi, the gentry, they give rise to people like Confucius. And so instead of like the sword, they go with the pen, the quill, or whatever, the stylus, and they start like transforming themselves in certain ways. And so that happened in the Roman world too, where like you had like a civilian aristocracy, even though they also like led the legions periodically. So obviously like pure militarism tends to degrade into like barbarism. It's unstable. It's not a stable scenario to have everything dominated by a martial ethos. You have to have balance, and the Axial Age brought that balance back. So you have Jesus Christ, who obviously is not a warrior, Prince of Peace. You have someone like the Buddha or Mahariva. In China, the Confucians were mocked for being peace-loving, unwarlike. Islam is somewhat different because Muhammad was a warlord as well as a prophet. But in theory, the abode of Islam is the abode of peace. right? So Muslims are not supposed to make war on each other, and there are rules of war with the Dar al Harb, the abode of war, where you can war. Christians, they had the rules of warfare that were supposed to mitigate conflicts between Christians and all this stuff. So war was a constant pressure, and we developed cultural evolution to dampen it and reduce it, because war is glorious and it shapes the souls of men, but is also hell,
So,
and yeah.
so how do we understand war? Do we understand war more at a group selection level or at a kin selection level?
It depends on what type of war. If it's like prehistoric tribe, it's probably more of a king selection, although there's still group selection aspects going on. By the time you're getting to early polities and the early empires, like the Bronze Age, Iron Age, I would say it's more of a group selection thing, and it's cultural group selection in particular. I point out the victory of Caesar over the Gauls was not a biological conquest, because the modern French are predominantly descended from the Gauls. It was a cultural conquest, because the modern French speak the language of the Romans. They speak Caesar's language, and their Christian religion is Roman Catholicism. And when the Franks conquered them, they called themselves Romans. They had become Romans in their mind, right? And so that's a cultural conquest. It's cultural selection. The spread of the Romance languages is the victory of that Latin culture
Hmm. All
through
right. So
war and
maybe
peace.
now yeah. So basically, the gist of this part where you write more destruction than creation. So before I segue into what I want to maybe have it as our closing discussion is, so I guess the history of humanity is the history of people who won in the end, right? They're just people fighting, and the ones who survived to tell their story. Is
Yeah,
that pretty
that's
much
just
the history of humanity?
I mean, that's a necessary. I mean, yeah. I mean, at some level, yes. But I mean, warlike ones didn't always win in the end, and I didn't. I'm going to write a later post, probably considerably in the future, because I want to write other things right now. Um, the Axial Age is the victory of the weak against the strong,
Hmm.
of the ethical weak against the strong, because ideas are more powerful than the sword, right? Because blood and bone are finite. Like, you can defeat their body, you can destroy the scholars in China, but you can't burn all their scrolls. Their ideas persist. And so Imperial China is the heir of the people that were physically oppressed but intellectually ascendant, you know? And Christianity conquered the Roman Empire. These sorts of things. Hinduism, transformed from Vedic ritualism, where there was animal sacrifice and whatnot, and Hinduism, Buddhism, all of these movements were, promoting vegetarianism and all these other, peaceful activities. And in India, the Brahmin is above the warrior, in ritual purity. So I think, like, the next thing that I would talk about would be kind of like the transformation of the valence of war. And in some societies it's complicated, because, like, so let's say Britain during its imperial period, this is a warlike society ruled by gentry that serve in the navy and officer class and all that stuff. Um Prince Charles, and Harry and William, like, to this day, and Philip, uh their profession is as soldiers. you know so the ruling class are soldiers. They're officers, but they're also Christian, and Christianity is, like, it valorizes peace, so there's, like, that tension there. But you have societies, like in much of Europe, where militarism is still at the forefront, and then you have other societies like China, where they really did not like militarism. They thought it was bad and destructive to human flourishing, and I mean, it kind of was, Um, the European elite had, like, they had a different interest, because they got their status through victory, because there's all these states that are competing and stuff. In China, it's like one empire, so, like, how would you fight in a war? Well, I mean, it would be like a civil war, which is bad, or you're a brigand, right? So, um, I think that there's these diversities of views, but you're seeing a generalized Pinkerian tendency to diminish the respect for war. War is all of a sudden a tragedy.
Mm-hmm. So, you write this. You say human minds and cultures are fundamentally poorly equipped for our nuclear age, when the heads of several states could each unleash weapons of such ferocity that none has dared to against. This is a horror that announced their birth 75 years ago, but a small probability is not a zero probability. Um, okay, let me put it this way. All right, I understand what you're trying to say over here, that you have the probability of the nuclear button being pressed, and the potential for devastation because of the nature of the nuclear warhead itself is so high that humanity as we know could be done. But then at the same time, don't you think it has also led to a lot of peace because of the mutually assured destruction that is there? So how do you figure kind of
Yeah.
balance the two scenarios out?
But they don't need to balance. It's like, you can have a situation. I think I don't want to say it like this because it's not very optimistic, but here in the United States, one strategy of forest fire suppression is we're very proactive and we prevent any burning from occurring. And okay, so there's very few forest fires. The problem is with so little burning, there's vast like dead tinder that's drying over decades. So when there is a fire that breaks out that can't be suppressed, it is a mega fire. It is a cosmic fire. It is a gigafire, right? And so you have a situation where you can dampen risks, dampen problems, and then it gets to the point where when there is a problem, you have no defense because all of these things have come to the head and they boil over. With nuclear war, I think it obviously is similar. Like nuclear weapons have a massive deterrent effect, although Russia's still doing a conventional invasion of Ukraine. Anyway, I don't want to get into that, but the point is, yes, I agree with you. Nuclear weapons have a massive deterrent effect. The problem is it is totally irrational to do a nuclear exchange, but humans do irrational things all the time. And so, if there's like a 1 out of 100 chance, you guys can Google it. There's something in the early 80s, I think, and there was like some Canada geese flock, something like that, that was like in the United States or in Russia. There was almost a couple of times during the Cold War where there was an inadvertent false alarm and they were going to like release an ICBM. And like one of the case, the Russian commander who was supposed to do a yes contravened it and was just like, no. Now, if he was wrong, Russia would have gotten bombed by an ICBM.
Yeah.
But he just was like, no, I'm not going to do it. And it turned out it was a false alarm,
Yeah, there was a movie on this too in Hollywood.
Yeah. And so my point is like, okay, what if he had actually followed his official orders? Because he's like, there's nuclear weapons coming to Russia. The rule is mutual assured destruction. That's his order. People follow orders. Like for example, people don't always do the rational thing. The Germans knew, especially by Stalingrad, that they were going to lose. Okay, not the average German, but the leadership of the Wehrmacht, et cetera. That's why they tried to do multiple assassination attempts and coups. But they didn't do as much as you would think because people just continue to follow orders, even if they're crazy. And so my point is, we're not totally rational. We're mostly rational, but we're not totally rational. And if you're not totally rational, something crazy can happen. Also, people, they end up doing things that they don't mean to do because one thing leads to another. One thing leads to another, and all of a sudden they're like, oh, I don't have a choice. I'm going to have to do this, And I don't actually necessarily believe there's going to be a nuclear winter that's going to like destroy all human life. But I do think some sort of nuclear exchange is going to transform things. If there's like one nuclear bomb, if like North Korea sends a nuclear bomb to Japan and kills like 5 million people, okay, that's really bad for Japan. It's kind of bad for the world, but it's probably not going to have a massive impact on the rest of the world directly in terms of climate. But that act will have broken a taboo. one nation now, besides the United States, has used a nuclear weapon on another nation. And there's a lot of nuclear armed states now. You know that in the Indian subcontinent. So once the taboo is broken, I do think it's going to be much more likely that somebody else will break the taboo again. And I'm not saying we're going to get habituated towards nuclear exchange, but right now it is unthinkable. I think, like, it would be a massive. It's unthinkable, like a global pandemic. It was unthinkable. You know, like it's like we're supposed to like have a global pandemic for decades, and all of a sudden, since 1967, we haven't had a big one, and then we had a big one, right? And then it happened. So we were scared of the nuclear winter and the Cold War, and then nothing happened, and now we're basically like no, it's never gonna happen until it does. So I think if we keep having nuclear weapons and we're in the status quo situation, yes, like some stupid nation or stupid, the issue is like there are countries where there are no safeguards, like the leader of the country can press a button or whatever, I mean, I don't think it's just a button, but you know what I'm saying. A very, very crazy leader could do this, and then the subordinates maybe have to proactively block that person, but then they have to make a judgment whether the leader is crazy or whether the leader is rational and this is what the leader wants to do, and so legally they should. Do you see what I'm saying? I mean, it's like, do you really want to rely on humans like making all these decisions all the time? I think like most of the time it'll work out, but some of the time it might not.
So essentially what you're saying is civilization is a very thin veneer.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was like, with like the blood babies. I mean, I think Germany is proof that civilization is a thin veneer, because that was arguably the most civilized, cultured nation in Europe. It was the most philo-Semitic nation on continental Europe in the 1920s. It was the most pro-Jewish nation in continental Europe in the 1920s. I'm not trying to scare anybody out there, but I mean, I think Germany is a warning that nobody is invulnerable. Humans are not invulnerable to this sort of like regression and barbarism. I mean, let me go back to the Mycenaeans and the Iliad and the Trojan War and all that. The legends of the Cyclops came from classical Greeks, like let's say like end of the Dark Age, 800 BCE. They saw these like vast citadels with like stone without mortar and stuff like that, and they're like, oh my god, like it must have been like giants that made those, like giants. Those were their own ancestors 400 years earlier. So humans like in Greece had regressed. Like they didn't have writing. Their ancestors had become legends and heroes and giants. Like they were amazed by these vast fortifications that were built by these alien people. Those alien people were their own ancestors, but they had fallen so low, and so we too could fall low.
Yeah. One last question. So in that sense, what do you make of all of this in the age of social media, where every day we go on social media and we have these doomsday scenarios, which obviously are not borne by the data? I guess whether it's Ridley or whether it's Pinker, I think they are more correct than say Nassim Taleb, who says, oh, they're wrong. I don't know. I don't buy Taleb's analysis over there, because Taleb always uses that one single event to say shit is going to hit a roof. So in that way, in a very weird way, in a comical way, don't you think social media is good? Because all these angry people, they get to take out their frustrations on a daily basis, and then they go back into their rooms and live a very peaceful life.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there is the argument that for displaced aggression and rage. I think that is a legit one. Like, I think also, I don't think pornography has been really great for American society, honestly. But I think like some people that were rapists and other things probably spend their time looking at really perverted pornography instead of raping.
Okay,
so I think some of the
let me explain it to you by an even contemporary example. See, I watch mixed martial arts. Let me tell you, if mixed martial arts did not exist, a lot of these people who are mixed martial artists or boxers, they would have been career criminals.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, some of them become criminals, right? I mean, they go between the two.
Yeah. But just
Yeah.
think about it. Like, look at the story of Mike Tyson. He was stealing stuff, and then he finds Customaro.
Yeah.
Customaro takes him in, nurtures him, brings him up, and that's the story of so many fighters, right? They have
Yeah.
this instinct. They're just like they're proverbial hammers looking for a nail,
Yeah.
and then they find this thing which teaches them to control their anger. So
Yeah.
they're like a directed missile. So in that sense, what I'm trying to say is social media, in a very weird way, has kind of given us this outlet where we can, in a extremely non-physical way, lash out at each other. And while we might think the world is burning, it's actually just burning in front of our screens because we are releasing all our anger there, and then we go back to our
Yeah.
friends and we're just relaxed, right?
No, I agree. I think that's true. Well, okay, like if everyone becomes like a fat like lump in front of a screen in the metaverse, obviously all of this stuff about war. So I mean, like one of the issues with no, why are you laughing, man? One of the issues, I mean, you're gonna see it when you come to to North America, particularly the States. One of the issues with this idea of civil war and militias is uh like we fat as fuck. I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like, you're asking a lot of like a Jeep to like take these like fat fucking militiamen into the woods. And then like they're trying to like run through the woods. Like they can't squeeze between those trees. So, I mean, like this whole idea of like civil war in the United States, I'm like, I mean, I know Twinkies are unperishable, so at least they can like take them into the field, but well, so what's her name? This like representative from Missouri. I forget her name, but she's a larger woman, and she slept out like in front of the Lincoln Memorial to like get student loan or not extend student loans or something like that. But she took Twinkies. She was hungry, you know. And I'm just like, okay. I mean, she's keeping it real, you know. So my point is, yeah. I mean, I think like these men can be violent too. So obesity, like lipids, are a signaler for estrogen, and so being obese does feminize you, and I think the wiener gets smaller and stuff like that. But also, you're less aggressive, and it's really obvious for men that I've known who've undergone massive weight loss. They have told me like, why do I like want to beat people up all the time? And I'm like, welcome to manhood. It's just because they can't handle their aggression, and they're kind of like anger at people. They have like they're much more hair triggered than they used to be. Whereas before they were bathed in like estrogenic hormones triggered by their massive like lipid excess. They're like, oh, I'm hungry. It's just like, when's dinner? Like, and now they're just like they're always hungry, not because they're big, but because like they're calorie counting. They're just like angry, and they're like, what are you looking at? It's just like, yeah, like chill out. No, but it's just like trans women or men or whatever, where they take the testosterone and they're just like, whoa, why am I so like, it's testosterone, welcome to my world. I mean, like I haven't killed anybody yet. You don't understand like what a struggle that's been. No, only half joking.
Yeah. So yeah, I do understand what you're saying, and actually, it's all about that. In fact, I've always said this. A lot of people whine about social media and all these new mediums. In fact, I say it's a net positive. It's a net positive. It has let no, it has over democratized the discourse sometimes because you come across real dumb freaking people, but at the same time it has given a release mechanism to so many people that I feel that we might eventually find world peace because everybody will be freaking busy fighting on their computer screens, and everybody will like, I think the next wars are not going to be fought on the fields. I think the next wars, like you have spoken, your pieces or your essays are about physical wars. Like we get into physical wars, we physically harm each other. I think the best thing about digitization is going to be we're going to hack people's systems, we're going to take their money, we're going to capture your banking system, we're going to take out their power sources and stuff like that. That might lead to less loss of lives in that sense. So maybe it's not that bad a thing.
Okay, so I think like, we got to close out with like a comment here that I got to point out, and I do allude to it in the piece. Drones. Drones have resulted in very much less loss of life for Americans, but a lot more loss of life for other people. Ask Russian generals, you know,
Mhm.
drones and American technology. So yeah, we have digitized and metaversed some aspects of war, and maybe in the future, wars will be between drone armies, and like mechs of some sort, robots. But that doesn't mean that it's not violent. And once one mech or drone army defeats the other, is this gonna be like cricket? And we're like, okay, you won. We'll give you, some money. All of a sudden, the drones and the robots are just like, okay, we got some organics to rip to shreds. So keeping it real, like I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, we're very creative in being evil as a species. We're very creative in being good too, not hating. But we're Janus faced here. We're two sided. So, and that's what war is like. War is hell, but war is also creative. So obviously guns. I mean, I guess it's mostly, but it's for hunting. Like spears, swords, Roman roads. Roman roads were for the legions. They're still used. The Via Appia is still used. Okay. Roman roads are for the legions. Airplanes, obviously driven by military. Trains and railroads were used extensively during wars for logistics. Obviously, a lot of types of like vessels, like steamships. A lot of the wood, or not the wood, the metal ships were originally for war. So a lot of things are originally for war, and then they get transitioned into civilian usage. But war is also like, look at the tens of millions of people who've died, thousands of people who've died in Ukraine already. America, we've had tens of thousands of deaths in like Iraq and Iraq over 20 years, hundreds of thousands of injuries and casualties. So the human impact is huge, but there's good things that come out of it too. I think today, innovation is driven partly just by greed and just like wanting to be awesome. So I think one of the keys is, I don't think innovation was driven by like the need for glory in ancient wars, because like that's a separate issue. I think the innovation was just driven of like, we don't want to be killed. Okay. That's straight up, I think, what was. But now, there's this need for glory and acclaim that ancient warriors used to get. Now it's just like Elon Musk, like, I want to go to Mars, you know, which, like, the Greeks understood